thinking I'd kind of do a little bit of a, like, because Aaron had said something like 5 minutes, so I thought, is that fine? Because I thought I could lay out a couple themes so that's everything.
Would love.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm sure, like, I feel like a lot of our themes are going to be, like, the same. Like, I just read your piece about your letter. Yes, yeah, that's fine.
Well, I know, in your piece, it was just such a great timing. Oh, I'm right here. And actually, our lovely board member, Stephen Gomez, the legend, handed me a mask. So, no, it was so funny because I parked 3 blocks, so I was trying to make it all work. And I'm like, oh, no. I felt naked.
I'm really excited for the movie to be on Family.
And so nice to meet you in person.
Absolutely.
Exquisitely organized conference.
So far, so good. More to do.
Thanks, Aaron. You're doing great. Oh, can I find you after this panel?
Sorry to create stress this morning. Because I saw Marie sent email. Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, fine. You have my number, right?
Yes, yeah, I can find it.
I probably do.
Thank you. Okay. Your mic is hot, so we might as well just leave it on.
Oh, so everything I'm saying.
I don't think it matters. I'm going to get very brief. Also, I've seen other panels taking their masks off to talk, so I think I'm going to likely do that as well.
I was just tested too, so.
I know.
I know, but it's
theater that we're all part of. Hi, everybody. We're going to get started here in just a minute. We are down 1 panelist today, so there will be 3 of us, which I think is fine. I have every amount of confidence in these 2 individuals in their ability to talk us through this. All right. Hi, my name is Hanna Brooks Olsen. I'm a writer, political consultant. I was recently in Seattle. Now I live in Portland. For a small amount of time, I was the editor-in-chief at Real Change News in Seattle. And now I just write sometimes as a nice thing to do.
for Street Roots.
And Street Roots, and now I write for Street Roots too, which has been I actually chased down the editor of Street Roots because I was like, I live in Portland now, and this is what I write about. I also have my other current Portland claim to fame is upsetting a lot of NIMBYs on Nextdoor through an article I wrote entitled, "You Are Not the Victim of Homelessness." So that was, I felt really good to sort of make my stand. So I'm coming at it as a writer. I'm just the moderator, though. And so I'm going to let our other 2 panelists introduce themselves and introduce yourself and give me like 5 minutes on what you do and what you're thinking about with all of this.
Sure. Do you want me to?
Yeah, let's go that way.
Okay.
Yeah. Kaia.
Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kaia Sand, and I'm the executive director of Street Roots, which think that a number of you got in your packets, which was fabulous that the conference organizers thought to support Street Roots vendors by doing that. So we are a weekly street newspaper, and that is a model in which people on the streets experiencing poverty and maybe housed insecurely can just come in, low barrier, go through orientation, start buying papers for $0.25 to sell for $1 plus tips. So it's kind of a micro-entrepreneurial program. We also do other things that I'm happy to get into, but I just wanted to give you that framework. It's an international network based in Glasgow. So there are street papers in Brazil, South Korea, in many, many places around the planet, and we work together, which has been really important during the pandemic. So Street Roots was founded 22 years ago, and one of our co-founders likes to say we were founded in advocacy. A lot of the earlier advocacy was around the criminalization of homelessness. And how I frame in my head the advocacy is that we're both encountering and trying to knock down the barriers that people experiencing homelessness, or what is in front of people experiencing homelessness, and we try to increase the options. So we are working in this relational way, person by person by person, while we also do advocacy on a systemic level. And what I wanted to address this morning, or I should say I want to put some themes out there to see kind of where they go and what you're interested in. So weather. I'm not really going to talk about the weather. But I'm thinking about the weather right now because, last week on the corner where we work in Old Town, in the tent, one of our neighbors, and I love that this panel is named in terms of our neighbors because it's not just proximal, but it's relational. one of our neighbors had a daffodil that was stuck in the tarp of his tent. You know, that's his bouquet, right? He's festooning spring onto his tent. And I could just see spring everywhere. That same tent, of course, was thick with snow yesterday. So weather impacts people living in public much more deeply. And even though we know that it's the disruption and the chaos is human caused, we can't really control the weather on a day-by-day basis. But a lot of policy, a lot of political pandering, a lot of these wild plans schemed up by people with a lot of money who have impacted development in the city, who are going to solve homelessness quickly, all of that is experienced like weather, out of control for people on the streets, right? So that so often it's just sort of imposed on them. People have these storms coming through, and you know, there's multiple plans this last spring in this city in our period of backlash, of a new kind of backlash. And one of them was just a local plan in Old Town. And Old Town, for those of you outside of Portland, is the neighborhood that's north of Burnside. A lot of the neighborhood of Old Town, you know, has this new plan, and it involves sweeps. But you know, we see that imposed on people like a storm. And so I think of one fellow who goes by the name Wookie, who was camped in the same spot long enough that it was almost like an address. Like if we got a phone message for Wookie, we could run down and find him. Of course, this new plan sweeps through. He's swept immediately. Where does he land? 4 blocks to the west, but now he has a punctured tent, right? So that's kind of how that all continually plays out. So when I think about that, when I think about all of these different kinds of plans that are imposed on people, I also think about our history of advocacy at Street Roots. And I think the one thing I want to add, having that sort of adjacent to that theme, is the indefatigable and nimbleness, the indefatigable commitment and nimbleness that it takes with any kind of advocacy, like the kind of work that all of you are thinking about or working on, that's necessary, because anything that's a tool can become a weapon. And I don't say this in a cynical way. I actually say this in a hopeful way, in the sense that if you can read the present well, you can be somewhat prophetic, right? And so if we are reading our present well, we can also see sort of what's coming with what seems like a tool. I know this maybe is a little cryptic to say it that way, but I would love to dive into that in any area, but I'll say the 3 main advocacy campaigns were really kind of picky and strategic with what we take on at Street Roots. The 3 that I would say in the last 3 years have been a program called Portland Street Response, that's about non-criminal matters on the streets being addressed by first responders who aren't the police, and all the different ways that we responded to the pandemic, and now something we're calling 3000 Challenge. And things that we were advocating for during the pandemic, we've actually had to adjust to, because we've seen how anything that's a tool is a weapon. And so I think I'm going to leave it at that, but I'd love to dig in a little bit. I'm thinking about like the shelter to housing that is a topic here, and the kinds of work that at Street Roots we've advocated for with villages, but also the ways in which that can be manipulated and used. And so there's a kind of commitment that it takes, right, to watch and push and watch and push. So I'm going to pass it on. And I look forward to talking more with you and hearing from you.
Yeah, thank you. How do I turn my mic?
Oh, you just push the button.
Boop. Okay, great, thank you. I wouldn't say that's cryptic at all. That reminds me of Octavia Butler, that if you can read the present well, you can look into the future.
Yeah.
And what does she say? It's not hard to do once you learn how to do it. So. My name is Trisha Patterson. I'm a board member of Portland Neighbors Welcome, which is a co-sponsor of this event, of this conference. And I really thank you all for being here, for showing up. I'm also a grad student. I am in the public policy program at Oregon State University. I'm researching housing and GIS. I have been involved in organizing since I first went to college, I guess when I was 18, getting involved in electoral organizing, in mostly climate related. I really started out first with being focused on energy. And it wasn't until I had my own, I was confronted with housing issues as a tenant and had some housing instability that I realized just how important and how intersectional housing is. And then I moved back down to Portland. I'm from the area and got involved with Portland Neighbors Welcome right at the tail end of their work on the residential infill project. So doing phone banking, calling people, asking them to show up to council, doing like the mobilization work. And that was in 2018. And so I guess since then, I got on the board in 2020, and we were engaging kind of in one campaign at a time, taking things slow. One of our founders, Madeline Kovacs, she said, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go slow, go together. And I have really taken that to heart. And so through this panel, we'll talk about shelter to housing. We'll talk about how Portland Neighbors Welcome leverages its capacity and its expertise to folks on the ground who maybe don't have the same capacities and same expertise that we have. How do we marry those two together? And that's me.
All right.
Yeah. Should we get started?
Let's do it. So I'm gonna start by, so the name of this panel is Showing Up, right, for Unhoused Neighbors. So I want to talk about what showing up looks like for both of you and in both of your organizations. So one thing I'm very keenly aware of is the messaging around what we talk about. And I think within this room and within this space, it is very challenging sometimes to marry the needs of showing up for the thing we know we all need, which is more housing, but also showing up for people as they are, where they are. And then that, I think, can bring us into the shelter housing continuum conversation.
I can start, yeah. So showing up for people as they are, how they are, to me means it's an assessment, it's an accounting practice, but it's also, it's a practice. It's looking at, what are the skills that we currently have, and what are the privileges that we currently have. In Portland Neighbors Welcome, when we started, it was a predominantly white, predominantly male, a very educated, wealthy group, as many YIMBY spaces are. And the thought had to be, okay, this is our reality right now, and it's not necessarily what we want. We want to include more women, more people of color, people of different lived experiences, but we don't want to leave that privilege on the shelf. That, as for me, in my whiteness, it can be really uncomfortable to think, am I taking up too much space? Am I speaking for other people? And so meeting people where they are, it's kind of like meeting yourself where you are and thinking, what do I have to offer? And how can I utilize what I have to offer for liberation?
Yeah, thank you. So I have always grappled with that idea that I think is just a lifelong practice of how to love the stranger. And I think about that on a relational level, and then I think about that on a systemic level, right? Like on the relational level, how do I continue to practice that better? On the systemic level, how am I thinking about people I'll never know and practicing out of a space of love in that way? So at Street Roots, with that, we really bring into our hearts this notion of hospitality, and that and we actually, I mean, on a really practical level, learn from people in the hospitality industry. You know, bartenders are fantastic, right, at de-escalation, for instance, but also in terms of welcoming. That, you know, when we have a space that people on the streets are coming into, they're empowered in, they're running the coffee stand, all kinds of things are happening, but it's always important to address people by their name, offer people beverages, you know, do all these things of hospitality no matter what one's social class. So our model then is so relational in that way, in the sense that that's part of, people are selling a paper, yes, but they're also out there in public spaces so that folks can know each other across difference, conversations can take place. And I see, I'm looking at someone in this room to know that that can mean then knowing your neighbors who are intense, right? And coming to, and some folks don't want to be known, but some folks do, and getting into that space of actually knowing people's names. And I really think this is, it's a policy, right? It's like policy deep to be thinking in that way, because we, as kind of connected to what I was talking about in my opening remarks, it's so important to continually learn from people on the streets. And I think about that in the way in which people are so resourceful around survival and so creative, right? Like creativity is part of survival. So it also can inform policy, it can inform the way we think about things. And, you know, it's the micro to the macro, or in Brazil, there's that term jeitinho, like the workaround. You're working around something till you can get to what you need to get done. That's what I see practiced on the streets every day. And I have plenty of stories, but I'll stay focused on going forward, because then going from policy, and I'm talking about the relation, coming to know people, right, knowing their name, et cetera. But there's also then, how do we, in larger ways, have people impacted by policies inform policies, and continue to inform policies. So we're always thinking about this at Street Roots, and kind of, you know, everything is kind of always something to try to figure out. And what we've come to see is that one thing we're somewhat adept at is that we have people who are either homeless or formerly homeless, who can go out and run a survey better than someone who's housed. And we just had to get better at this. We started working with Portland State Homelessness Research Action Collaborative, because they can write a really good survey and they can evaluate a really good survey, and we can do the in-between really well. So we did that with Portland Street Response, because to inform the policy, to inform the design of a new system, by doing a survey, unhoused people, going out to unhoused people, asking them what do they need, and then tabulating it. We did that with the Metro tax measure locally that went into support services. Our folks went out and, you know, in a matter of a week, got to 250 people to then get information about what it is that people might be looking for. So, and there's a lot of ways this can happen, but I think it takes us all creatively puzzling through, right, is how do we go from the very important relation of person to person to the kind of policy level, system level of getting those voices in.
I love that, because I think a lot about how do we show up as people who, you know, are currently housed, for people who are not, when, like, we know that, like, the Maslow's hierarchy makes it really hard to show up if you're, you know, if you're unhoused, right? It's very hard to advocate for yourself when you're also, you know, when your background, like, function is not all the way there, because you live outside and you're not sleeping, and, you know, your cortisol levels are, like, way high. And so I have often tried to walk that line as well of how, but I think a lot of times for organizations, and when you're working on campaigns, when you're working on, you know, housing policy in your city, it is really easy, like Trisha said, to have, like, a lot of, like, very educated people who have a lot of data to sit down and say, well, we think this would work. And until you back up and say, okay, but would it work for people in that situation. Like, I will never forget, I lived in Seattle, which is like peak, like guys in vertically striped shirts thinking they have all the answers. And I remember like some like urbanisty guys talking about like, oh, like, you know, if we just made everything like cashless, then people who are living on the streets like wouldn't have to worry about losing their cash. Like they could just have like a card. Like they had like some idea about like cashlessness as being beneficial.
I know.
And I was like,
You approached me.
and I was like, no, literally no. Have you ever spoken to a single homeless person? Because like the idea of going fully cashless is, first of all, many are unbanked. And so I was just like listing all these things that I knew to be true. And he was like, man, I never, yeah, wow, yeah. And I was like, so I think like the idea of showing up is also a lot of showing up to like open the door, right? Showing up to be like, yeah, and get in here. And sometimes, you know something that the street papers do really well is help people find that voice to show up. Because I also know from working with people who are living unhoused, they have, first of all, amazing stories. Incredible story. Like if you like, incredible. Are you guys gonna be mad if I do a small swear? Okay, so I used to coach public speaking at a permanent supportive housing building to help people get ready to talk in front of city council. And my person that I did it with was a comedian in Seattle who's exquisite. And one of his favorite icebreakers is, tell me the worst time you ever fell in love or the best time you ever shit your pants. But I will never forget when one of the women who was living there, and she'd lived outside for like 15 years, she was just like, anyone who says they've never shit their pants has never been homeless. And I was like, that is very real and alarming. And like, it just, I will never forget that moment. But it's the kind of thing that you get, I feel like, when you actually ask people, like, what is your experience like? And I think, so I will get to asking a question here. But we're down a panelist, so I'm just going to. But I do think that there is a question of, like, how do we, it's very easy to just be like NIMBYs, like, they just hate homeless people, blah, blah, blah. But then I feel like a lot of times, even in our, like, well-meaning YIMBY spaces, like, we don't actually accept the lived experience and the, like, and don't go out of our way to, like, ask, like, oh, wait, maybe we actually don't know everything. So a recent success or something that's happening in Portland is the infill, the housing infill, and like what was the name of the policy that passed?
Shelter to housing.
That's the one. Yeah. Well, yes, I said it earlier. Yes. But it is the kind of thing that is sort of hard to explain to people until you're like walking through the personal experiences of the people you're trying to serve. You know, because right now there's an effort in Portland to take a lot of money that was supposed to go to multiple kinds of housing and just put it all into just shelters, because they think that just shelters should work, when like there's very little data, none data to support that. And it, like, those kinds of like arguments against, abundant housing, community housing, strike me as the kind of things that people think are well-meaning but are not based in true experience. So Trisha, especially because you were like on the phones, as well for things, and you're an organizer.
That was for residential infill project.
Yeah. So tell me, how was it like having those conversations with people?
For RIP, that was mostly mobilization, so turning out our members, people who were already familiar with the project. But for Shelter to Housing Continuum, when I would have conversations with journalists or with other community groups that had concerns about the policy, like very real concerns, they were often bringing their own priorities to the table, and not necessarily thinking about, who is this supposed to benefit, but thinking, what if this hurts me and my priorities, and how do we ensure that this doesn't hurt me and my priorities? And so, to your question, like what kind of responses, like what was it like?
Yeah.
I guess there was a lot of, I wouldn't say misinformation, but reading, a policy document that is 50 pages long, and then the appendix is like 80 pages long, gives a lot. And I remember I was talking with Rachel Monahan at the Willamette Week, and I was like, well, have you read it? And she was like, no. Why would I read that? Like, give me the London, like, what the heck? And so there was a lot of explaining, a lot of trying to decouple the emotion that when we see homelessness, it's like a visceral reaction, and everyone has a very strong opinion and reaction to it because it's a humanitarian crisis. It's awful. But the policies that we have behind it, we kind of have to take a step back. And I would say, to the larger of what this panel is for, I think that was one thing that Portland Neighbors Welcome could do and could do well. And one space where Portland Neighbors Welcome can partner with groups like Street Roots, like you were saying with the survey, like PSU can make an amazing survey, but can't necessarily distribute it. Portland Neighbors Welcome can read through these policy documents and do the cross-referencing and maybe make some suggestions that are coherent and will probably work. We can organize the meetings with commissioners or with their policy advisors and see, what is really going to be feasible here, and then go back to our partners who are on the ground and say, okay, this is what we can get you, this is what we can't, and where's the compromise here? Like, it takes everyone, and it's just, yeah, if you want to go slow, to go together.
I love that. I mean, I think all hands on deck, and that
All hands on deck, yeah.
it's like
And
you
that's
figure
what it
out what you
felt
can
like.
bring.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, and I was thinking about, like, with I remember, the financial collapse of 2008, and I started really trying to learn about everything that happened that led up to that moment, and I realized the power of obfuscation, right? The financiers could make things so complicated that no one could intervene, or most folks didn't have the time to learn and intervene before it happened, and I could do the kind of post-mortem and be like, oh my God, right? If only we could have intervened. And I think about the work of doing that, of really understanding code and understanding zoning and that is such an important thing that you can bring to the table, because you can cut through the obfuscations that is a form of tremendous power, and you can intervene before things happen.
I love that idea of bringing your strength to the table, but also Trisha, to your point at the beginning too, identifying what it is that is your strength and being very honest with yourself and saying okay, my opinion and my gut reaction might not actually be what I'm bringing to the table right now. I might actually have to sit with that for a minute and then figure out what my thing is.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important piece of self-awareness.
Right. Well, and it was a process that we had to go through at Portland Neighbors Welcome and say, okay, we have advanced degrees. We have people who can show up to council and speak really nicely, people who counselors will engage with and who can explain their ideas. We have people who are resourced, who are housed. How do we harness this capacity for this project?
And then, kind of connecting then back to, and when I was talking about in the beginning, things being turned from a tool to a weapon, thinking about all of that and the fact that at Street Roots, we really supported it because we did see all the barriers to solutions, right? Like that if there are these barriers to just getting things done and getting different housing options out there for people, we wanted to tackle that. But I also, I think it's, in terms of being indefatigable and really watching things and staying and pushing and how important that is too, because I think we're in a really difficult moment. So our organization helped start Dignity Village, and that was in the year 2000. And it was tremendous. It was the first houseless-led village, I think, in the country, and really brought forward that concept of the village. And later on, I got very involved in Right to Dream too. And one of the things that I saw with that process was how empowered people were through governance, so that there were people painting the Houseless Bill of Rights on doors and going down to Salem. So it wasn't just the sleep that was offered. That was a safe sleep project. It was also the fact that people had new ways to kind of electrify their skills and their abilities. So we've always supported this idea, the idea of the village. We've supported Hazelnut Grove and really fought the city on efforts to try to tear that down 2 years ago. I sometimes almost flatten the pandemic into a year. So 3 years ago, I don't know. But and then early in the pandemic, because we knew that the virus was spreading in shelters, because we knew services had just been stripped away. I mean, Starbucks closing their doors meant bathrooms were gone, you know? I mean, like things like that. So then we fought for a city-sanctioned kind of camp called C3PO. And through that, you know, we were able to get some things going. But now we're in a different stage. And we're in a backlash stage where that same thing that we fought for creates the seed for something else that, you know, in terms of what you're talking about earlier, one of you was talking about the kind of the push toward mass shelters. Well, that sort of sanctioned outdoor campground is being used to then try to get people out of sight. And so I want to, and I'm happy to talk about this more, but I want to give a little plug to Portland State's report they issued last week on villages. It's a how-to manual, but it also breaks down, I thought in really helpful ways, elements of successful villages. And I often think about it like community and autonomy, right? Like people need to be able to have doors that they can lock, and people need different things. So I don't want to, but I think the larger kind of thrusts of what makes a successful village is, you know, having that autonomy, but having community and having some level of governance, of self-governance. And that doesn't mean it has to be entire self-governance, but some kind of input. And what I'm seeing happen now with these things that we thought were more liberatory is they're being used to impose a really different model that is stripping out a lot of that governance, a lot of the community, and making them more expensive by layering upon layering upon layering. In some ways, systems of control, some of them are helpful, some services are helpful. A lot of it is about shunting liability because, you know, you need the nonprofit to absorb the liability, so the public structure's not doing that. And they get more and more expensive, and then you compare them, and actually the same amount of money or even less can get someone into housing with support services. And suddenly it's like, what is this Frankenstein, right? It looked very different, you know, before. And it feels a little bit to me like the hot water on the frog, right? Where I'm like, oh my goodness, I think some of the stuff we were fighting for is being used in really different ways.
Yeah, one of the things you just mentioned, which I think is very germane to this audience, is the idea that not everybody needs the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I think about this a lot with solutions to housing, and especially having just moved from Seattle to Portland, I can tell you that Portland is quite a bit more dense in many ways than Seattle is, because Seattle is all single-family zoning functionally. And Portland, you can have duplexes and and I walk through my neighborhood and I see all these like gorgeous triplexes, and I'm like, look at this. But it is something that is noticeable because there is different zoning, because there's different will, and because people want different things. And I think that when we sort of flatten it out and say, like, shelter is it, we're also sort of saying that, like, people who are living outside, like, don't want different things or don't need different, like, that one solution works for everybody. And I think in a housing capacity, a lot of times what that means is it dense housing? Is it supportive housing? Is it a village? Is it a safe RV parking lot? Is it just overnight shelter for some people who aren't ready to, you know, like go into a more controlled environment? Is it tent villages? Because the nice thing about sleeping in your tent is you don't have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning every single morning, right? So like, when we talk about housing and neighborhoods, I think there is also a real need for like those of us who like the idea of having different sorts of folks in our neighborhoods, and also of just getting people housed, to say like it really is a buckshot approach, right? Not a bullet approach. Like it really is like doing a lot of things. And so I think too about like the projects that are happening here in Portland that are trying to meet those different kinds of needs, because I know Street Roots has worked on some, PNW has worked on, right? The difference between not just being like all shelter all the time, which seems to be what NIMBYs are into, mostly. I appreciate that you said out loud to keep people out of sight, because that is literally what it is. And so, like, Trisha, I'm curious, how like, how do you balance, and Kai, you used the word nimble earlier, and I think that's exactly right. How do you balance the need to like be working on different kinds of things and not necessarily always be able to have like one unified, campaign or message?
Yeah. Portland Neighbors Welcome takes kind of a trifecta approach where we have our equitable zoning group, housing people in crisis, and tenant protections. And all of that is united kind of under our board structure. We're an elected board. And the thought behind it was that housing is intersectional. It's very interconnected. And we were recognizing that there's no silver bullet. There's no perfect solution. And so being able to run different campaigns or supporting, a lot of times it's like we don't have anything new to say in this space. Like the tenant space in Portland is saturated. It's good to go. All we need to do is amplify what is already being done. And the same thing kind of for housing people in crisis, that we saw a need and a gap that we could fill, but that there was a lot of policy leadership already from folks like Street Roots, that we didn't need to come up with anything novel, that it was already being done. And so when we speak to nimbleness, I guess I would say that's my best answer, is trying to stay open and within our minds, but then also having the systems in place to allow for nimbleness, to say, okay, this is my working group's priority. This is what we're going to work on, and we're not going to have this mission creep. We're going to really try and stay within what's our bounds and what's our responsibility. Who are our people? And I think a big part of that is trust building, is showing up for other people's stuff, going to other people's events, like logging on. Like one of our board members, Candace Avalos, oh my gosh, I love her.
She's our board member too.
And she's on your board member too. You know what? And what has probably happened with Candace is she will join simultaneous stuff, like just to show up and just to be like, hey, I'm here, I support it, I'm doing this thing as well. And it's stuff like that. Like it's my role, I guess, within Portland Neighbors Welcome. I'm kind of like the wagon wheel. Like a new space, like a new person shows up in our space, and I'm reaching out and having, a 30-minute chat of where did you come from? How are you doing? Like what kinds of projects are you interested in working on? What kinds of resources do you need? Given that this is an all volunteer organization, cultivating those relationships is key. And in a previous, just the panel that was right before this, there was kind of like this tension between, is this extractive? Are you just asking people who have the most resources, who have the most time to come and give you things? Or is this like a supportive space? And I think that Portland Neighbors Welcome, I love the group. Like it is rare to have a group like this. I think that we thread the needle in a pretty smart way, where it is all volunteer and there are people that are very well resourced, but it also supports and gives capacity to members and to partners who maybe need that capacity. So yeah, trust building, systems, it's all interconnected. It's very interconnected.
I'll address nimbleness in campaigns too. I see in our organization, because we're working so much with unhoused people in terms of mobilizing, but also always in relation with housed people. It's all relational. Nimbleness is a combination of extreme need and political opportunity. And sometimes those two marry and become systemic change. So systemic change might be a little bit lofty, but they last. So just thinking about with the last 2 years for all of us have been pretty extreme. And I think one of the things we started to see early in the pandemic was there were some pretty extreme needs, and we had to just we had to just shift on a dime. And so, one of them was actually toilets. And toilets became a political opportunity. It was extreme need and political opportunity because there were no toilets. And we were saying this for years as people would complain about feces in the streets, right? We could say it in all these different ways, but it wasn't getting through. Then we're in a pandemic and the extreme need was more extreme and the political opportunity was there. So, I logged a lot of hours calling a lot of people but some of it was that Street Roots then would just be nimble and we would just act because the city couldn't get a porta potty and we had so many people descending on our corner just trying to go to the bathroom. So we rented a porta potty. And of course, we couldn't really manage it very well. We rented multiple ones and they became a disaster. I will just say. And the city responded, and the city created a program. And then they said, will you put your logo on many, many toilets around the city? And we said, sure, this will be fine. So now there are many porta potties around the city that are red, and they have a Street Roots logo on them and I think that just recognizes our yelling. But the thing is, the people who started to work on that were city employees who were also ready. Like, there were people inside the city that really knew their stuff about toilets and about public access. And so they also could mobilize. And then one of them has actually just left the city government, but she made sure that she had more pathways for those toilets to last before she did. And now she's getting more permanent toilets in from that. And those red toilets haven't gone away. So and there's so many examples of that where it's like responding to the need, but finding the political opportunity. And then once that's there, how do we build from that?
When I first moved to Portland, like the week I moved, I drove past one of the red toilets and I took a picture and I tweeted it and I was like, look, Seattle, you can just put in toilets if you want to. Because I was like, this is such a win. I was so happy.
It was a win, but it's kind of like,
it's toilets, right? Like I've spent so many years yelling about toilets. It's real.
And then recognizing the win later that, because I have to remember that too. We can move so fast. We're like, hey, those toilets were a win. Mm-hmm. And they're lasting, and now we build on that. Yeah. And we've been needing that for years.
Yeah. I was working for a very short time, and then I sort of gave up because I was too exhausted with the people I was working with. But on sort of trying to bring together, like, the running community with the, like, homelessness outreach community.
And runners use the red toilets.
Exactly. Because I was like, who needs outside toilets? People who live outside and people who spend a lot of time outside. But it was an example of sort of why I was wondering why I wasn't seeing that intersection in, like, policy. I was like, why aren't runners showing up for toilets? Like, y'all have time.
Well, and just one more thread with that is the person in the city who was working on the toilets tried to get it through earlier, and she tried a really creative strategy because people would complain, the NIMBY kind of backlash. So she tried wrapping toilets in the Portland carpet motif. I'm not kidding. And then there were a couple other patterns too. There was a plaid or a couple other patterns. And I thought it was just so creative because she was like, well, instead they'll post them on Instagram, right? instead of fighting the city. That didn't take hold though quite as strongly as actually the political opportunity and the need marrying during the pandemic. And that's actually what finally did it. But I like that she had a strategy. It's just you have to keep trying.
I like keeping that in your back pocket too. Like when in doubt, just like try. I mean,
the Instagram postable.
Make it cute.
100%. And also like the option to like get like probably some private sector companies would be down with putting their logo on a toilet. So like maybe there's funding there, right? So that's that creativity and nimbleness. So one thing I love that you just talked about though is that like functionally organizations are faster than governments, right? Like that's just a thing. Like we know this. Organizations can get things done and maybe you make a mess of it, but it forces action. And I think too about things like, guerrilla crosswalks and people who go out and fix their own sidewalks when it won't get fixed, people who are filling their own potholes. And like you might not do as good of a job because you don't have a steamroller, but you can get it started. But I think there's a need for both an extreme amount of patience and also knowing when it's time to just be like, nah. Because also like one thing I want to ask you about specifically, Kaia, is you wrote a letter for Street Roots about the need for people to sort of be patient when their systems changes, like with street response, because you just wrote about street response and how people are already, right, the program's just started, and already people are like, it doesn't work, I'm on the phone too long, moo. And so, like, that's exactly how they sound. That's a direct quote from next door. But there are times where it's like, yeah, we worked and got it done. And then you have to sort of be patient for a little while once you're in that space of, like, let's see how it goes. And so I'm curious about, and, like, Trisha, to your point of, like, go slow, that, like, once you roll it out, like, there's still a slow walk once something is out there. And people, I think, expect results real fast.
Yeah, I'll just briefly, for anyone who might not know what Portland Street Response is, so just backing up, and again, I'm going to be bringing up political opportunity and need, and I'll add journalism into the mix. I think a lot of people locally knew for years that we had a really good model to the south of us, Cahoots. And Cahoots is run by Whitebird Clinic in Eugene. It's been since the 80s. Whitebird's been around since the 60s. And it's been a non-police first responder system for street crises, as well as house crises, but non-criminal ones. So there'd be a medic and a crisis worker who would go out and honestly, one of the big things they could offer is to just simply, how they said it to me is, hear the story beneath the story, right? Instead of plowing through and adding trauma, they could actually meet someone where they were at. And just to give an example, when I was on a ride-along with them, there was a man who was having a mental health crisis on the streets, and they were called, and they just listened to him. They found out he had an untended wound. They treated it, and then they found out he actually had cancer and was missing an appointment and didn't have a way to get there, and they drove him there. And so there were stories beneath that story, and it just took some patience and some listening. So in Portland, we had a great model, but it was just really hard to get that kind of mobilization to do a system change. And Commissioner Joanne Hardesty, started talking about creating this kind of model in Portland in 2017. And then the Oregonian newspaper published an article and this was a real sea change, I think, locally, that showed that over half of all arrests targeted unhoused people, 52% in Portland. That number is held. So this, I think, was one of those moments where people, is just enough, right, of a jolt that folks not only were like, this is not working, and we are paying for police to do this, like over half of what they are doing. So we, as an organization, saw political opportunity in the fact that happened, and that we had a commissioner who was incoming, who was supporting it. And so we started pushing and working, and there are other layers to it too. A Bureau of Emergency Communications that was ready. We went out and talked to them. They knew that the system wasn't working. They had 911 operators. I'd sit next to them, and they were so demoralized because they were getting all these calls, the next door of 911. It's like where 911 was becoming a next door hotline.
It's the seventh circle of hell.
Yeah, but I mean, how demoralizing to be a crisis worker or a crisis operator. And so we knew there were just all these different things lined up. And so then what we could do as a non-government organization is that knew enough to be dangerous, right, is that we could say, we can fix this, and we made a plan. And then we issued that plan on March 15th, 2019. And that was laying out for the city what it needed to do to create the system. And a lot of layers happened since then. And I would say patience, but I want to make sure that maybe I use endurance and that word indefatigable as really more than patience, because patience that's active, I would say. right? Because the program's gone citywide, but I sure don't want people sitting back right now, because it needs to be funded a whole lot more than it is right now. So I think if people care about it in this room, it needs funding in this budget cycle, and the budget meetings are starting this month for those of you from Portland. I don't want to be taking for granted there are people from other areas. People need to turn out and demand that money goes now, so that when you call, you don't have those delays, because it needs to be 24/7. It needs to be big enough. So it is our constant work, actually, outside the government to support and push and push and push.
When you mention the budget cycle, I remember when Portland Street Response, it started in Lentz, right? Yeah. And that's a neighborhood in deep southeast Portland. And it originally wasn't supposed to go beyond the bounds of Lentz. And I remember the discussion around it being, we just don't have enough data. We just don't know if this will work, so we don't want to push it and give it enough money to go citywide. And I mentioned at the beginning I'm a grad student, and in my studies, in my classes, we talk all the time about data, about cost-benefit analysis, about how policy decisions are made. And the thing that has just been hit home is that inequality is a policy choice. And the more that I thought about Portland Street Response, the more that I thought, like, the data is there, because currently, before Portland Street Response was a thing, is our EMTs were Portland Street Response, that they were the medical workers, they were the crisis workers. And I was hearing this. I had a really good friend from college. We were teammates, really close friends, have continued to be friends. She was an EMT in Wenatchee, Washington, in Seattle, Washington. And the stories that she would tell me about the calls that she had and the people that she was responding to, that it wasn't necessarily medical emergencies. Like, sometimes it was that someone needed someone to talk to. They needed a ride to their doctor's appointment. They needed someone to take them to the grocery store. Like, and the difference is, I think, between very rural Wenatchee, Washington, and Seattle, with lots of overdoses and lots of people experiencing crisis, it just highlighted for me that we do have the data. We do know already, if we would just look maybe beyond where we think the data will be, if we can open up our view to what is already there.
I love that. I mean, I think you're so right. In 911 systems, they track data, and there is a lot of data locally. And I think about, too, when I was talking about any tool can be a weapon. I mean, data, of course, we know this, can be fetishized. It can be used in really manipulative ways. And so, like that moment, the city council, 3 council members blocked funding the program to actually just pilot itself in a larger way. And it was, I think it was a fairly dishonest moment. And one of the things that was really difficult about it was that we actually were helping with the report, the evaluation, because our folks, our ambassadors, and they still are doing it. They go out and talk to people on the streets, what I was talking about earlier, that piece of what we do now, and to get feedback for the evaluation. And we knew that the whole evaluation was designed actually in this really kind of beautiful way of getting simultaneous feedback to continue to adjust, so that the program didn't ossify, right? That it could be a nimble program. And this, I do want to give a lot of credit to Commissioner Joanne Hardesty, because that was really her brainchild, is to do simultaneous evaluation for a long time. So this was not a style of evaluation that would decide whether the program would go forward or not. That wasn't even the design of it. So it was taking something and then weaponizing it.
It's such a struggle, too, when you are stuck in that limbo, and I think this is very true about, like, housing decisions and land use decisions as well, is should we try this thing and see if it pays for itself? Okay, but we're only going to pay for it to 66% or whatever.
Yeah, that's a great
And
way
it's
to
like,
say
well,
it.
of course. of course it's not going to perform. Of course it's not going to. And you probably knew that. And I feel like that happens a lot with land use, a lot with housing, and certainly a lot with like the more like experimental, you know, villages and that kind of thing, where they're just, it can be very hard to get that like robust funding, which I do think is like then can be the role of organizations like folks who work here to shore that up and ensure that things work even when larger people try and make it not work.
Well, it's kind of our job to make things work too. I mean, that's part of as being residents of a city, or I mean, that we have that responsibility. Like with Portland Street Response, I mean, I think now we have to be watching it and making sure the impacted communities are part of the staffing. We need to make sure that it's a multilingual program. We need to make sure, right? Like, and that's all, that can't just be sitting back and being irritated about it. That's again, the push, indefatigable work of system change.
Do y'all have questions? I suspect you do. We have 18 minutes remaining, if I can tell time accurately. Yes, you, sir.
There's a question in the actually the narrative about the breakout section I was hoping maybe Trish could start with, and then maybe Kaia could pick it up. It says, how does undersupplied housing impact a region's homeless population? This seems to span terms of work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Can I repeat the question real fast?
Sure, yes.
It's the question that's from the description here, and it's how does our regions like housing or lack of housing impact homelessness and its reverberating effects?
Yeah, housing abundance is absolutely tied to homelessness. And I'm kind of thinking of like, what do I want to say first? I would say, so there's this analogy that I can't remember if it was Michael Anderson at Sightline or if it was someone else at Sightline, said that housing shortage is like a cruel game of musical chairs. And yes, many of you have heard that. That when we have a house, and we know in Oregon that we have a housing shortage. I think the numbers from the DLCD are like, it's like 155,000 units short because we need 584,000 units over the next 20 years, and we need 155,000 of those right now. That when we're operating in this housing shortage, those who are most marginalized, those at the bottom who are least resourced, those are the people who are most likely to be doubled up, who might have to move out of state or will become literally homeless on the streets. And so the nexus is absolutely there. And so that gets to more of what kinds of zoning policies do we have, what kind of rules do we have around density, any incentives to builders to build affordable and dense housing. So in the residential infill project, there was this really genius deep affordability amendment. Yeah, that's what it's called. That was designed by Neil Heller and Madeline Kovacs, and the mathed and it worked, where you could have a sixplex that had a certain number of deeply affordable, meaning I think it was 30% MFI. And so when we are, like, inequality is a policy choice. And when we're designing our cities and, you know, thinking what do we want our city to look like over the next 20 years, the next 50 years, those are the questions that we're asking ourselves. And so then within the context of this panel, there's folks who are on the ground today. How am I going to live today? We have to bring those interests together. That our housing shortage is not going to be solved tomorrow. It's if we increase, it's like if we triple market rate production over the next 20 years, we might. That's like what the DLCD says. So it's complicated. Does that answer your question? Ish. Okay. Okay.
It's a big question that I think there's probably a wealth of knowledge in this room for, but I'll just say, you know, with the folks that I work with every day, there is such an enormous chasm between the possibility of housing, right, and life on the streets. And because housing wage is so high in our city, because housing is so expensive. It also even plays out when, you know, if someone is able to get affordable housing that they want to hang on to, it's hard to do other things. Maybe they have a VASH voucher from the, federal government or another kind of voucher. And it's also then extremely dangerous to get a job, to earn enough to be providing for their needs, because then they might lose that housing. And it's a housing market where maybe they're going to get a job. Maybe they can get a job at $20 an hour, but that's not $27 an hour or whatever the housing wage is right now. So there's that deep chasm even then between actually having affordable housing and then if you lose it, actually being able to buy rent market rate housing.
And I think that speaks to like the cliff effect that happens with many of our social services, that if you end up making too much money, you are out. And that it's really scary for people.
But I will say, it's just so important to realize too that it's so that if people can get housing, how transformative that can be. And one of the things I think that's really fortunate that I get to see is, even though homelessness itself is so widespread, that I also get to know people just about every week who are getting into housing because of all of the work that's been done on the back end. And that, I think often of this one man who struggles with his addiction, and still struggles with it. But so many things didn't work on the streets. Shelter certainly didn't work for him. And his mental health was just in shards. But now he's in housing. His mental health is stronger, still has his addiction, has a pretty good job at Albertsons. So like that, every single time that happens, you can take away quite a bit of the distress, and maybe some of the problems are still there. But my goodness, I mean, housing is so much.
Yeah, it's fundamental.
I mean, I think often about the idea, one thing we fought about a lot in Seattle was whether or not it should be like acceptable to drug test people before they could get into housing. And all I could think was like, you try getting sober on the street, dude. Like, come on. Like, that is not how humans work. That's not how, substance use disorder works. Like, that is not functionally a way to help people. But I think too, this speaks to the idea of needing lots of different kinds of service again, too. Permanent supportive and tiny homes and whatever. Because some people need more help than others. Yeah, right here. Yeah, that's you.
So I'm a graduate planning student here, almost done.
Congrats.
Congrats.
Yay.
Anyway, we talk a lot about, I have a couple of thoughts that are sort of related, but one is, there's this idea that you're talking interfacing a lot of politics and political leaders, and I feel like planning, occupies this interesting kind of middle ground between like people, citizens or the residents, and the government. I mean, it's part of the government, obviously, but planners aren't necessarily like beholden to elections and things. So there's a little gray area that I find kind of interesting, I guess. But I'm curious, like, what do you see? What do you most want to see in the relationships, or have your best experiences or worst experiences in relationships with planners specifically?
Oh, planners are great.
Yeah.
Should
But because like the bureaucracy has been taking a long time. A lot of things we talked about, are related, like often planning all the time, and I don't know. Just wondering if you had thoughts on that interaction, and secondarily, like in an inverse perspective, I guess. A lot of you're producing a lot of you guys are producing a lot of things. You're talking about producing plans, documents, things yourselves that are making their way up, or suggestions for processes. And like at least Portland is welcome. It's like an all volunteer organization. There's many great volunteer organizations doing a lot of work. And like, I wonder if anyone has thoughts on that dynamic of like who's doing the work, and like, is it right that there's all these people who aren't getting paid to do this work? So those are kind of concept factors.
Okay, first, thoughts on planners.
Okay, yes. Okay,
serious
so
thoughts on it.
before I went to school for public policy, I was seriously considering a MERP and a Master in Urban Planning at PSU. And all of my experiences with the planners, Sandra Wood, Eric Engstrom, in Portland have inspired me. Like, they inspired me to go back to school and pursue public service. So maybe my experience is biased, but I find that planners and people who work in the public sector are incredibly smart, genuine, humble, friendly, willing to go the extra step, and also have the policy knowledge to know the map, like to know deeply the consequences and potential outcomes of any kind of political decision, whereas they're the administrators, right? Whereas in the political sphere, I have seen examples of commissioners or politicians maybe saying something or saying, what if we did this? And their policy advisor quickly cutting in and being like, yeah, we can't do that. We really can't do that. And so they play a different game, right? And my experiences have been wonderful with planners. Has it been the same for you or no?
Yeah, no. I'm grateful for all of the work that everyone's doing pitching in. So I don't really feel like I have something deep to respond to that question with.
Okay. We could do the second question. What
Yeah.
was your second question?
Volunteering.
Volunteering.
Yeah.
Right.
I'll start with
yeah.
that. Yeah, I think that's in all. I'm dealing with it maybe more with folks experiencing homelessness, but I will say on that level, people are asked to volunteer their time all the time. Testify for this, do that, and I'm always pushing that they get money. And Street Roots has just started paying people even when we can't get them paid, because they have expertise that they're lending. And so I think, it's really, really important to be doing that. And I just think that labor itself, it's just, right, in our country, it's so messed up in terms of people bringing in their skills. And this is going to be a little bit of a tangent, but when you were talking about cost benefit analysis and earlier, I just came from a conversation with this senator on the Eastern Oregon in Oregon, a Republican, who had a really profound thing to say to me, that he thought the rural-urban divide was cost-benefit analysis, in the sense that he was trying to say that so many things in rural Oregon cost more to do. And I'm working with that because I thought about that with so many other areas where when they don't price out, and I also thought, God, this might be a really great bridge because we don't pay the right amount of money for the things that are really important to do in so many other areas.
Yeah, and to your second question, I have been observing and thinking about the ways that planners, administrators in Portland kind of orchestrate their own success by intentionally reaching out to community groups like Portland Neighbors Welcome, and building those relationships. And we have relationships with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. We have not working, they know us enough of the council members, when we have our council meetings, enough to build trust, to share ideas back and forth, propose ideas, so that when we do make our 2-pager and we have our little presentation, that they can take our ideas seriously, that they know that it's in good faith, and that if they follow our steps, they'll come to the same conclusion.
I think we have a few more questions.
Yes.
Right, with 5 minutes.
Let's right here.
Yeah.
I want to repeat the question real quick. She wanted to know what are some of the upstream causes that we are looking at or that we can see that sort of housing folks, planning folks might not necessarily consider as a potential down the road, impact.
I mean, I think the criminal legal system, right,
Word.
is something that we really focus on because I think that can get overlooked in terms of its relationship, from everything from people who are released from prison and they request our Rose City Resource Guide while they're still in prison because they know they're just going to be homeless. There's nothing there for them, and then they face so many barriers. That's why we tackle things like Portland Street Response, is just trying to get further upstream. But then, of course, all of the systemic racism that is entangled in that. Another area that, I think is really powerful, this is maybe less of an upstream cause of homelessness, but an upstream way of looking at policy, is that, like the mortgage interest tax deduction locally, that we now have a really great report that the state auditor issued to show that this is a racist policy that supports the wealthiest people and is the largest housing subsidy in the state. And then Street Roots will run a story tomorrow on other taxes in our state. There are just so many that, again, are racist, that are contributing to this wealth divide. So those are just two things I'm just going to throw out there right now.
And I would say this is a good exercise for me to go through because I honestly I don't have an answer, and I think it's because I'm so focused on what is that I think that, thank you for your question. It helps me grow.
It's a good question for everybody. I
is.
have some I want to add really quickly. So discharging people into the streets, big one, right? It is absolutely, I watched Mindy's panel yesterday with Mercedes and Cole, and just talking about how absolutely criminal it is to discharge people into the streets. Like and like at all different times of day when there's nowhere to go, like no shelters are open, like just the absolute churn of that. Transportation, hospital or jail, both hospital or jail,
And hospital to jail pipeline where people...
the jail to hospital to jail pipeline, it's a circle, transportation, and specifically how we plan transportation. Transportation, as we think about it, a lot of us think about like your city bus map, and it's kind of like a wagon wheel, right? There's like a hub in the middle, and then just like that. That's how men have commuted for a very long time. Women tend to trip chain, and so it is much harder for women, say single moms, or anybody outside the typical 9 to 5, to do things like go to the store, pick up the kid, do the thing, then get home. So transit planning, and a lack of transit. Childcare, just period, full stop. And city government's not updating their voucher programs to reflect the cost of living, right? I lived in Seattle for 12 years, and during that time, I do not think the cost or the price of a rapid rehousing voucher to keep people in their homes ever went up. I think it remained $600 the entire time, which is a third of what a one-bedroom apartment costs in Seattle now, but it just never went up. They just didn't do anything to it. Oh, yeah. Yes. Yes. Right, exactly right. That like Tacoma is not the same. So that when we do offer services, we have to offer services that actually function.
I know a few people didn't get in, so I'm happy to stick around too and just talk to anyone who wants to talk.
Yeah,
I see
will
we're
sit
out
here.
of time.
We are at time.
Much.
Thank you all. Thank you for your interest in this.
Yeah.
Thank you.